Did you know that Louis Armstrong, the jazz trumpeter, grew up working for a Jewish family in New Orleans and often wore a Jewish star? Did you know that the lyricist of Billie Holiday's searing ballad about lynching in the South called Strange Fruit, that the lyricist of that song was himself Jewish? And so too was the owner of the New York nightclub where the song debuted, and the owner of the record label who produced it, and that the owner of the record label was related to Billy Crystal, the comedian. Did you know that the first black American to win the Nobel Peace Prize, Dr. Ralph Bunche, won that award for negotiating the ceasefire that ended Israel's War of Independence in 1949? Did you know that Andrew Young, the first black American ambassador to the United Nations, was forced to resign in 1979 by, among other factors, Jewish political pressure after he met with a PLO representative? Now, if you watch the new PBS documentary, Black and Jewish in America, An Interwoven History, and took notes like I did, then you already knew those things. Now, when you hear that title, Black and Jewish in America, what does it mean to you? It could mean that this documentary is about the experiences of being black and the experiences of being Jewish in the United States. What's similar about them? What's different about them? Comparing the two. Black and Jewish in America could mean the populations of black people and Jewish people in the United States and how they interacted with each other. Was it cooperation? Was it conflict? What were the encounters like? What were the natures and frequency of those interactions? Or black and Jewish in America could mean the intersection of those two adjectives. The experience and population of those who are black and Jewish in America. Both. In Israel, for example, over 150,000 Ethiopian Jews live there, about 2% of the Israeli population. And they are both black and Jewish. And there are debates over what proportion of American Judaism is black and Jewish, or a Jew of color, to use that terminology. In fact, a recent survey of the American Jewish population explored this question in some depth. So if you look at this chart at the top, you'll see that looking at how many Jews identify as white in some capacity, you've got 92% identifying as white, 1% identifying as black, 1% white and black, 1% white and Asian, and so on down the line, and about 4% identifying as Hispanic, either Hispanic alone or Hispanic and white together. Still, 92% of the American Jewish population is identifying as white, but there's some debate over these numbers. Some think the numbers might even be higher, 10%, 12%, even 15% of American Jews actually being Jews of color to some extent. And it depends how you define it. If you include Mizrahi or Sephardic Jews, then it gets even higher. Do you count someone who identifies only as another race, not as white and something else? Well, that also changes where the numbers go. And especially if you look at age cohorts, you'll notice that younger Jews are Jews of color in a higher proportion. Some 15% of Jews 18 to 29 in this study done in 2020 were Jews of color or multiracial, where only 3% of those 65 and older were in this category. So there are people who are black and Jewish. There's a growing number of people who are black and Jewish, and some of the people who are black and Jewish who are known and scholars in the field or active in that community are depicted in this documentary and talked to. There's some of the talking heads that you'll see. So this documentary, Black and Jewish in America, led by Harvard historian Henry Louis Gates, does touch on all three definitions, on the black history in America, the Jewish history in America, the interactions of those two populations, and a little bit of what it's like to be black and Jewish at the same time. However, most of the emphasis is on the first two and not on that intersection population. their experience is not primary. You get occasional comments like the celebrity chef Michael Twitty, who is Jewish and black, explaining his creative African American Jewish Seder plate and what he would serve at his Passover meal, reflecting both of his cultural identities. Or another activist pointing out how ironic it is that as Jews, he and his family are encouraged to remember an ancient slavery and to draw lessons from it, while as African Americans, the popular culture tells them to just get over African American slavery and Jim Crow, because that happened in the past, and why are you stuck on the past? Well, which is it? Which cultural value should he live out? And the irony is that black slavery in America and Jim Crow in America are in living memory, where the Exodus might never have happened. It's in mythical history. This is the irony of this conflicted identity or this complementary identity, depending on how they experience it. Now, there's 4 parts to the documentary. I'm not going to dive into each of them in equal depth. It's divided by historical periods, roughly, and each chapter includes examples of cooperation and conflict. So I want to take you through episode 1 just to start, and then talk about some of the other themes across the other 3 episodes. The first episode of the documentary is called Let My People Go. You can already hear a contact point between the cultures, between the Seder and the Exodus story in Jewish life and the African American spiritual, which itself was an inspiration for counteracting slavery in the American South. And so this episode begins with that multiracial Seder. And as an aside, I was sort of amused how many people in this documentary I've actually met in person, between scholars, people sitting around the Seder table, people I know who know people sitting around the Seder table. It was really kind of funny. I dropped an email to a couple of them to say, it was nice to see you, even if it was only in the documentary. And in that Seder setting, the historian Gates claims that anti-black racism and anti-Semitism are both sort of running under the floorboards of Western culture, even if they've played out differently out there in the world, above the floor. What I really appreciated about this documentary in all of the episodes was they did a very good job of providing historical context for both groups. So telling you something of the story of the African American experience, telling you something of the history of Jewish life going back centuries in Europe as well as America. And it was really valuable because you don't know who's necessarily going to be watching it. After all, you might get someone who's very versed in Jewish history but doesn't know much about Black American history. Or you might get someone who's lived the Black American experience but isn't as familiar with Jewish history of persecution in Europe in the Middle Ages. So it does give you that context for people coming in. And of course, someone might come in not knowing either of those from scratch, and they would need both historical reviews. I also like the fact that they had talking heads that didn't automatically tell you what group they were from. So you had some white scholars speaking about the African American experience, and you had some black scholars talking about Jewish culture and history. And it was really wonderful to see that variety of people. And that's sort of the point, isn't it? That we can all learn from each other and we can all understand each other's history and experience, and that makes us stronger and more well-rounded people. So this episode, Let My People Go, begins with a survey of the Jewish history of expulsion and persecution, primarily under Christianity, but also popular Western cultural tropes like the idea of Jewish moneylenders. And it actually makes a very clever historical connection. It ends the European Jewish history in the expulsion from Spain in 1492, which is just a few days before Christopher Columbus left for the New World. And what does Columbus do in the New World? He conquers, he enslaves, he wipes out large proportions of the native population and replaces those with African slaves imported to work the sugarcane fields. But it also highlights the differences between the Jewish and the American experience of coming to America. In 1619, the first Africans arrived and were increasingly subject to a brutal chattel slavery and the terrible Middle Passage across the Atlantic, where so many died even en route to the New World, a new world of slavery and suffering. But for Jews, coming to America was an experience of freedom. They first came in 1654 as refugees from the Inquisition that found its way to Brazil. The American Constitution imposed no religious test for office, which enabled Jewish participation in the new republic. One scholar points out that the Naturalization Act of 1790 allowed you to be naturalized if you were white, and Jews were included on that side of the line. Even if there was some anti Semitism, by and large, Jews were on the white side of that white black line. Now, this episode does also mention some of the complications. There were, of course, Jewish slave owners. One of the most famous Jews who had reached the highest office in the land up to that point was Judah P. Benjamin, who was the Secretary of the Treasury and the Attorney General of the Confederate States of America, as well as a U.S. Senator and a candidate for the Supreme Court. But he owned slaves living in New Orleans. It also highlights these thematic connections I mentioned of the Exodus story, the character of Moses in the Bible versus Moses, aka Harriet Tubman, actually freeing slaves, and of course the roots of that so-called Negro spiritual, let my people go. Another parallel that's found in this episode is that shift of the move, the Great Migration. But there were actually two Great Migrations. First, the African Americans leaving the South and Jim Crow oppression from those southern agricultural communities to great cities in the North and in the West. If you want a historical version of that narrative, by the way, read the excellent book, The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson, that talks about this great migration of millions of black people from the South to the North, to Chicago, to New York, to Los Angeles, and beyond. At the same time that this great migration of African Americans is happening, there's a great Jewish migration from Eastern and from Central Europe, where some 2 million Jews find their way from the old country to the new country. My guess is the ancestors of many of the people on this call or watching this video in the future come from that Jewish Great Migration happening between 1880 and 1924. Now, what happened to those blacks moving up from the South and those Jews moving over from the East? Well, they met each other in northern cities, and they often found parallels to each other's experience. It was fascinating to see how many stories in black newspapers talked about the pogroms in Russia, and how many stories in Jewish newspapers talked about race riots and oppression of blacks in the South, and even talking about events in the North. After all, there were race riots in Springfield, Illinois. There were race riots in Chicago. We don't always talk about them, but they happened here too. It wasn't just the Deep South. They were both moving for greater social opportunity, greater economic opportunity. It wasn't just fleeing oppression, it was the positive draw of hope. This chapter of the documentary highlights positive partnerships, like W.B. Du Bois helping to found the NAACP with mostly white and largely Jewish founders, including lawyers that he collaborated with to start the first legal cases to change the situation of black Americans. Or the other famous example of Julius Rosenwald, who was a Jewish, initially a shopkeeper, that took his family business and turned it into the Sears Roebuck Corporation, the biggest mail order company in the country. And he was based in Chicago. He used his money to help the African American world. He was connected with a man named Booker T. Washington, who was focused on basic education and technical skill for the African American populations of the South. And between Booker T. Washington and Rosenwald, they created a network of schools called Rosenwald Schools, where Rosenwald would provide 1/3 of the funding, the local school district would provide another third of the funding, and the local black community would provide 1/3 of the support for the school, including lumber and even physical labor to construct it. Some 4,000 schools across the country were built for these communities, sometimes 1-room or 2-room schoolhouses, but it was a safe, secure building in which to learn. And maybe 1/3 of black children were educated in some variety of Rosenwald schools. So this is describing, as you see, some of the tensions in the community, the black slave owners in the South, the Jewish slave owners in the South, the Jewish success in the North, but also the collaboration between the two populations. There's plenty more to see in the other 3 episodes, and it's easy to find on the PBS YouTube channel if you don't find an old-fashioned TV broadcast on your local station. And I do want to highlight a few of the highs and the complications and the lows that the documentary also presents. The biggest high, the peak as it describes it, the Grand Alliance, is the 1960s, early 1960s civil rights movement. There are the marches and the Freedom Riders. There are white rabbis like Abraham Joshua Heschel, who marched with Martin Luther King Jr. in Selma, and many reform rabbis showing up to support black ministers like Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. I also like the fact that, and this often gets overlooked, a large proportion of those freedom riders and marchers were actually not really religious Jews at all. They weren't motivated by Tikkun Olam or a reformed Jewish movement for social justice. They were what were called red diaper babies. They were the children of Jewish socialists, even communists, who were imbued with a passion for civil rights and racial justice from their Jewish background, but also from the political leftist background. Large numbers of articles appeared in the Jewish left-wing press about racial oppression and so on, even back in the 1920s and 30s. So this was deeply rooted in that part of the Jewish community. And I'm glad that the documentary recognized the fact that it wasn't only religious Jews, it was also secular Jews that were part of this push. They also faced similar dangers. Both Jewish synagogues and black churches were bombed in the South. The famous murders of Cheney, Schwerner, and Goodman, where three people, young people looking to register voters, two Jewish and white and one black, were caught by the Ku Klux Klan and were murdered. There are the legal battles from the NAACP and Jewish organizations and ordinary people on the street who work together with their neighbors to support affirmative action. It caused some tension when it hit college campuses and Jews began to feel like the quotas were keeping them out. And when it got shifted to a message of diversity and inclusion, then Jewish organizations became more supportive of affirmative action, to use that example. But what that highlights for you is the next theme, that it wasn't just the highs of success, it were also complications. The fact that the founders of the NAACP were almost all white took a while to shift. And you can hear, even in that fact, that there's a bit of, is it paternalism? Is it guiding the uneducated or organizing the uneducated? That didn't sit well with the people who were actually African American and educated and could organize their own population for themselves. There was also some frustration that so much attention was given to the white clergy suffering and not to the black clergy suffering, to the white marchers being beaten and not to the black marchers being beaten. Why so much attention to them? Just because they're white. There were also some tensions over the different trajectories of Jews and black Americans after World War II. You had all these desegregation fights in the 1950s, trying to integrate schools. At the same time this was happening, there were massive suburban developments developing. You might have heard of something called Levitt towns, named for a developer who came up with the idea of building these tract housing with lots and lots of houses all next to each other, using the GI Bill to help pay for them. Well, guess what? Levitt towns were whites only. Some of them didn't even want Jews in initially, but they let the Jews in. They didn't let black people in at all. So Jews were able to participate in what was called white flight as white populations left inner cities, but black people were trapped in those decaying inner cities, sometimes with landlords who had used to live there. And so if the only Jewish person you met is the landlord who's keeping you in this substandard tenancy housing, well, it gets to create tension. And when you see Jewish people who used to live with you now moving out to the suburbs and doing better than you, it's hard to feel like you're on the same team all the time. In fact, sometimes Jewish organizers felt rejected when black Americans started doing it for themselves. The Black Power movement was saying we can do it for ourselves. And there's a voice of an older white woman now who was a young person in that time saying, I thought this was what I was going to do with my life, was organize and act on these issues. And now I'm out of a job because they don't want me. Well, it's not about you if the goal is social justice, after all. We had similar issues with the collaboration on jazz music. You heard that quote in the opening trailer highlighting the Jewish interest in jazz and the Jewish connection over jazz music. Wonderful collaborations, like the Benny Goodman Orchestra being the first integrated orchestra, playing at integrated clubs with black and white patrons listening. But also there was the fear of exploitation. You know, there's a story about an agent who worked with Louis Armstrong to help him, but also may have taken more of his money than necessarily he was entitled to. the issues of music labels and who's getting the right share of the royalties and so on, and even the question of cultural appropriation. George Gershwin, the wonderful composer, wrote a beautiful musical called Porgy and Bess after he went down to South Carolina, studied the population there, and then wrote this beautiful musical with the wonderful tones and songs, including using a librettist, DuBose Hayward, who himself was African American. But the challenge is that for many black people watching that musical, it's like seeing black life through the eyes of non-black people. And even if it gave jobs to black performers on Broadway in more dignified roles than they tended to get, it still felt not quite for us and by us, to use that phrasing. They also use the example of the roles that actors could play in Hollywood. Jews invented Hollywood. We're so proud of it. But the roles we wrote for African Americans and allowed them to play in the 30s and the 40s, even into the 50s, were so limited and so stereotypical and so frustrating to those actors and actresses who could have done so much more. It tells the story of Paul Robeson, who was a marvelous talent. He graduated law school. He was a Division I football player at Rutgers. He had a beautiful bass voice, but he kept being given the part to play of the slave and the servant, and he simply had enough. Now, he became so active on civil rights issues that he had his passport taken away by the U.S. government because of his support for the Soviet Union. At the time, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, the Soviet Union was very anti-religious discrimination. And so that's why J. Edgar Hoover would consider any integrationist a communist because the Soviets support it, therefore it must be communist. Well, Robeson got his passport taken away. He was traveling the world. He even went to the Soviet Union. And here's where the connection gets tricky, because Robeson had had so much support over the years by leftist Jews, by Soviet Jews, that he had a real affinity for them. He was close friends with a poet named Itzik Pfeffer, and he sang a song that we occasionally sing at Kol Hadash, Zognit Kainmol, Never Say You're on the Final Road. It's the Warsaw Ghetto Rebellion song. He sang it in the Soviet Union when Pfeffer was in a prison cell, because in 1947, the Soviets decided to arrest all the Yiddish poets that were active in the Soviet sphere. He tried to save Pfeffer's life in some ways by singing that song and dedicating it to his friend. At the same time, which the documentary points out, he didn't criticize the Soviet Union for its treatment of the Jews in public. So he defends Pfeffer on one hand, but won't criticize the Soviet Union on the other. So a mixed bag of reputation, but a product of this experience of frustration in Hollywood where he could have been a big star today. The Jews shared a persecution of experience with the black Americans, so much so that the Nazi Nuremberg laws were actually based on Jim Crow laws. And that shared experience of oppression led to longer support for Israel among older civil rights leaders. But the younger generation of the late 60s and 70s saw a disconnect between American Jews and American blacks, and increasingly saw Israel as an imperial power, a colonial power, to be resisted. And this takes us to some of the crises. Obviously, the most recent crisis of post-October 7th and the college encampment experience and changing attitudes towards the Palestinians and towards Israel, that has been a real source of tension between blacks and Jews most recently. But it goes back to the 1960s. The famous example in New York City of the Brownsville schools, where local control was given to a committee that then decided to change over the teachers and asked 19 white teachers, mostly Jewish teachers, to stop teaching in that district so they could be replaced with people of color that reflected the black and Puerto Rican population of the neighborhood. During that tension and the union fight for union jobs, as the United Federation of Teachers saw it, an anti-Semitic leaflet was promulgated in the community. And then the UFT made 1,000 copies and distributed it everywhere saying, look, they hate us, they hate Jews. And that led to the broader lesson, the broader understanding, blacks hate Jews, and that's why there's so much tension here. Remember, the late 60s is also a period of urban riots and white flight, exacerbating the tension and the distance between the black and Jewish communities. In 1975, the United Nations declares that Zionism is racism. And Yasser Arafat is invited to speak from the lectern of the United Nations, and he says that I have two things in my two hands, an olive branch of peace and the freedom fighter's gun. Don't let the olive branch fall from my hand. Now, this is after, bombings and shootings and plane hijackings. And so Israel and the Jews, for that matter, have no interest in thinking of Arafat as a freedom fighter, a fighter for justice. But some of the younger and more radical black organizations begin to think this way, even if the older legacy civil rights movement activists do not. So this is the context for that Andrew Young crisis, where he spoke to a PLO representative and then was pushed out of office. This is the context for Jesse Jackson, famously being quoted when he thought he was off the record as referring to New York City as Jaime Town and saying, when I go to the Jaimes, all they want to talk about is Israel. He apologized for that. But there were also unapologetic leaders like Louis Farrakhan of the Nation of Islam that were rabidly, explicitly anti-Semitic, and yet were featured speakers at the Million Man March in 1995. And they even blamed the Jews for the slave trade and for massive ownership of of slaves in the South. They claimed that Jews owned 35% of the slaves in the South, which is an absurd number given the number of Jews living at that time in that place. And this is actually where Henry Louis Gates got involved in the debate, because he's a historian and he said, this is ridiculous. It's just not true. And then he got flack. How dare you disagree with these leaders in our community? Well, this is one of those challenges. If you stand up for the truth, you sometimes have trouble. And then most famously in the 1990s, you have the Crown Heights riots between the ultra-Orthodox in that community, who are not the civil rights red diaper babies. This is an insular community that runs their own security services, that runs their own ambulance services, that doesn't contribute to the surrounding culture, where they're surrounded by Black and Caribbean Brooklynites who have their own cultures and are living side by side but not with each other. Well, what happened in this case was a car crashed into two young Black people riding their bikes, and the ambulance showed up and picked up the Jewish driver, because it was one of the Jewish ambulances, and didn't care for the kid that was left there on the ground. And so this led to 2 days of rioting. It led to Mayor David Dinkins, who was the first Black mayor of New York City, being unable to quell the violence, and to increase suspicion and conflict and even separation between the Jews of Brooklyn, the Orthodox Jews of Brooklyn, and the Black and Caribbean Brooklynites living right next door. Well, where are we now between success and complication and crisis? Well, despite our differences and despite the tensions between those communities, we still have a shared enemy. Just like the resurgent Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s was both anti-Black and anti-Jewish and anti-immigrant, so too are the white nationalists of the 2020s, both anti-Black and anti-Jewish. Compare the shooting at the Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston, South Carolina, with the mass shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh, or that march in Charlottesville in 2017 with the torches and the chanting, both anti-Black and anti-Jewish. One possibility that the documentary hypothesizes is that maybe Black Jews can be a bridge between the two communities. After all, they have experienced both and can share insight into both with both. Or maybe we'll be able to find common ground on aspiration, or on issues, or on shared need and shared concern and shared goals. The challenge will be, can we find common ground on some issues if we disagree on other issues? Well, that's going to be hard. I've also wondered, what would have happened if this documentary appeared on a different network? It was on public broadcasting. What if it had appeared on Black Entertainment Television, BET? What if it appeared on the Jewish Broadcasting Network? Who would see it, and how would it be received? Well, that's part of the challenge. If you have different communities with different views, they're going to understand the same thing differently. So I'm curious, for those who had a chance to see the documentary or have even seen parts of it, were there other things that I didn't talk about that you thought were crucial or important? Or even if you didn't see the documentary, are there any questions, comments, or reactions to that? David, please.
I have seen three of the four segments and have appreciated the historical view and wondered why a significant player wasn't mentioned in the first two uh, episodes at all. And that would be Henry Ford
Oh, well, I didn't talk about Henry Ford.
at all.
Well, you have to make your editorial choices. You've got to highlight some things and not other things. I don't know how much Ford had to do with anti-black racism to the degree that he did with anti-Semitism, maybe more than I'm familiar with. But that's not my field. My field is Jewish studies. And they do point out in the last episode the interesting debt that Jewish studies owes to black power, because black power was emphasizing learning about black culture and history as a source of pride. And so modern academic Jewish studies, to some extent, derives off of that multicultural influence, even if it doesn't admit it. But yeah, that's one of those challenges that you have to pick. I mean, when I first saw that this had come out, there was a review in the Jewish Forward by a Jew of color saying, "Why don't they talk more about black Jews? They're talking about blacks and they're talking about Jews, but why are they talking more about black Jews?" And I interviewed the producers, and they didn't give me a good answer, and he was very mad. Um, but I felt there was a fair amount of that in there, more than I had expected, to be honest. But for some, it wasn't enough. You're always going to have my favorite question whenever I've done a presentation at the North Shore Senior Center is, why didn't you talk about that? I've been talking for an hour and 10 minutes, and you're asking me why I didn't talk about something. Well, you got to choose. You got to choose. So Judy, I know, had her hand up, and then Ron and Sheila.
Oh, I didn't see the series, but I probably will find it very interesting. My daughter and son-in-law adopted two African children, so they would fall in the category of being, well, half Jewish and black.
Hmm.
Right now, it seems like they're doing fine with it. They kind of like we talk about it, and they kind of like the idea that they get to celebrate all these holidays. And they like the fact that Hanukkah comes before Christmas because then they get their presents before a lot of their friends. So right now, I don't know what's going to happen when they're adults, but I would like to see the series and see how, now that they fall into both categories.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One of the things that we've tried to educate even our own community on, where people have grown up used to Jews only being visually white, is that if a person of color comes to the congregation, don't assume they're a non-Jewish guest. They could have been Jewish longer than you, and more intensely than you, and know more
When
than you.
When my grandson was much, he was maybe 5, 6, and we talked about religion and when asked, "What are you?" He says, "My mother is Jews and my father's the other one. Like there's only two religions in this world," and
Right.
he was fine with that.
Yeah. Kids make sense of it a lot easier than adults do sometimes. Yeah. Ryan and Sheila, please.
Well, first of all, I saw all four episodes, and I think Dr. Gates did an amazingly thorough job, given the time constraints of compacting hundreds and hundreds of years of history into 4 52-minute episodes. The one thing that I don't think they really, I mean, they talk very specifically. The one thing, and my background is majority minority relations, the one thing they didn't really talk about in any great depth is the the foundation of Black Jewish relations is, and nobody addressed this, is the idea that we are both minorities, certainly in the United States, in a white world. And at one point, uh, there were two talking heads talking about it, and one of the they're both men. One of the men said, "I was in your class, and I said I'm not white, and everybody laughed at me." And then he pointed to the black professor, and he said, "You did too." And the black professor said, "Yes, I did." But I think people, certainly white nationalists, and that's the other piece that sort of came through but wasn't explicit, is the true groups tend to be somewhat more unified, as many Jews have known from their history as well, when it's an outside source attacking them. If there's no outside pressure, outside, power, we tend to kind of, bicker with each other.
Right. Part of the dilemma that they did highlight in the documentary is that Jews can pass as the majority, or they're treated as the majority. I mean, you just look at the reaction of, do you feel safer with the police or not? And Jewish communities tend to feel safer with police cars in front of the building and with police presence because their experience is that of white America, where the police are there to protect you. And the challenge for many people in Black America is they want good policing, but all too often the police assume that they're the problem. So when we were talking about increasing our security at Kol Hadash, we had to factor this in, that if we want to be a welcoming community, we have to, think about everybody's response to it, not just what the majority population would experience it to be. So
Yeah,
that's.
when they were talking about the police and being white and Jewish,
Mhm.
the first thing that came to my mind is that is why white people are standing up for immigrants, because it does bring more press and it does bring more pressure. And it's unfortunate that it has to be that way, but it is at least getting the information out
Right,
that
but you can understand some resentment on the part of the people who are being ignored.
there's
Yeah.
absolutely no question about it, but it's better than keeping it a big secret.
Yeah, it's a sort of a don't win dynamic. Any other reactions or thoughts or comments?
Yeah, I just thought it was interesting that even when we saw Black Jews, as in when the Ethiopian Jews were all brought to Israel, even still then they were um, put down because they had their own traditions and they weren't European enough. And they, despite being Jews longer than the Europeans had really been Jews, they were still oppressed and put down, even though they were Jews. They were black and they were Jews, and their customs weren't accepted enough. They weren't good enough for the European Jews in Israel, and that just made me sad.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that they didn't have Hanukkah because their culture sort of branches off basically with the Bible, um, marked them as different, and some wanted them to convert, even though they were brought there before that. I'm not sure that their Judaism is older than European Judaism because that goes back like to the Roman period. But in any case, the point is made that their exclusion is the antithesis of what you think, being one Jewish family is all about. But it does reflect the fact that Jewishness and color is a complicated category in Israel as well as in diaspora too.
Yeah,
Mike, did you want to jump in?
yeah. Just a question. Um, I'm sort of thinking about these various themes, the themes of heritage, justice, minorities, the sort of themes of class, common enemy. Um, with respect to Israel, how would you characterize that sort of the change over time from, you know, kind of 1948 today? Was the sort of a general downslope, consistent downslope, or were there some up periods in there? I don't remember that from the program.
Well, there were up periods and there were down periods. So, the immediate post-war period, these African American leaders, some of them had even been like in units that liberated concentration camps, and they had seen, the suffering the Jews had gone through, and this was the era of sort of that peak of Jewish collaboration. So, the civil rights establishment, NAACP leadership, and so on, were pro-Israel before 1967 for sure. Where the African American leadership began to split was in the late 60s between the Black Power movement, the anti colonial movement, which was a global phenomenon, but certainly across Africa, and the shift in freedom fighting messaging for the Palestinians. That really began to create this shift and even split within the black leadership over the old guard that was more supportive of Israel itself, and the young guard that was more supportive of liberation and anti-colonial rhetoric and thought, and more supportive of the freedom fighters because they saw themselves as liberating anti-colonial freedom fighters for African Americans. So that's where you really begin to get the split in the 70s and continuing into the 80s. You had some sort of recalibration of this that the documentary talks about during the Obama era, during the Oslo Peace Accords era in the 1990s, where there was seeming to be some decolonialization and some autonomy and freedom for Palestinians. So that led to less tension. And you can see anti Semitic attitudes in the United States going down as well during that period in the 1990s. And naive us who were living during that period who figured, oh, that's just the trajectory it's going to go. But it didn't. After the Second Intifada, there was an uptick of hostility between the two. You had some sense of a common enemy in the 19 teens from, say, 2015 to 2019. Think about these attacks on churches and on the synagogue, the Charlottesville, Virginia march, which is clearly both anti-black and anti-Jewish. So you're beginning to get Jewish organizations standing up for the George Floyd Black Lives Matter movement. A lot of Jewish synagogues and rabbis were involved in those initiatives. So you began to feel there was more of this coalition building. And then after October 7th and the aftermath of what happened in Gaza, it's accelerated that splitting between the two, particularly among the younger audience that doesn't know the Holocaust history, that doesn't know, the Oslo period. The Oslo is ancient history for people who are, under 30. So their experiences of Israel and the Intifadas and it's Israel is the powerhouse. That's been the problem. That tension and the experience of whether it's settlers or Gaza or armed conflict. Israel is seen as the colonial power and not as the oppressed people, where Jewish self-perception is the opposite. But I think, we are able to handle two truths at the same time. And it can be that Jews can both be oppressed and in the West Bank be acting like colonialists. And, we can do both. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. That's the complexity of it. And so some people see only one side, and some people see only the other side, and it's hard to find common ground. The last episode has a little bit of, again, they're trying to end on a note of hope, but it includes a dialogue group that was convened at UCLA by David Myers, who's a historian there, trying to create dialogue across difference to get people who were in the encampment side of things and who were on the Stand with Israel side of things to actually sit down and talk about hard things. As Tony Kushner says at the end of that preview clip, it's hard to do and it's dangerous to do, but that's what makes it important to do. So those kind of dialogue groups are really important to try to bridge those gaps and bridge those differences. So it's something that can happen by leadership or by lay people on any level.
Great answer. Thank you.